Hi there, everybody. I am going to be the book chapter discussion leader for the first two chapters of the book. And I'm also going to use this as sort of a model so you can see what I'm looking for when I ask you to present a chapter. I don't want you to just go through and summarize the entire book or go through every single detail that's in the chapter. I want you to make it kind of come alive by using visuals, images. You could use things like quizzes, pose questions, charts, pull other information or videos off the internet that help support what you're saying or what you see in the text, just to kind of make it come alive, because all of your peers will have already read the text. So we don't just want it to be a complete regurgitation. You can focus in on some key areas, some things that you found most interesting, maybe some things that you found more difficult that you wanted to dive a little deeper into to make sure you understood, and then help make them more digestible to your peers. So I'm doing the introduction to second language acquisition. I'm doing chapters 1 and 2, and you'll see I'm not covering all the topics. I'm just picking here and there, putting some together, etc. So before you get started watching the rest of this video, I would like you guys to actually, I'm going to go back. I would like you guys to actually click the Kahoot link that's on the discussion board, and I want you to play the Kahoot game. So it's a true or false game. It's got a series of 8 questions, and see how you do. I recommend that if you get less than 6 out of 8, that you go back and you reread the chapters, and at the very least reread the summaries at the end of each chapter to make sure you understood the major takeaways. And then I'm going to be diving a little more into those topics here. What is second language acquisition? That's what this course is all about, and it's a huge topic. So I'll read the quote, and then I'll give you a minute to stop and reread it to yourself. SLA investigates human capacity to learn languages other than the first. So that seems simple enough, but you'll see that second language acquisition is a really big field, and that there's some overlap in some other fields as well. You'll hear the terms L1 and L2 frequently. So L1 is that first language that's learned or acquired, and it has an effect on the L2, or the second language that's learned or acquired. So L1 first, obviously, and then the L2. So second language acquisition, you'll often hear them talk about the L2. So this is where it gets a little tricky. There's a different field of study of bilingualism. So how is that similar to or different from second language acquisition? And the answer is that they do overlap in some ways. So let's go back and imagine second language acquisition is here, this orange box, this second language, the language that's learned after the first. Seems simple enough. But then let's consider someone who grew up in a bilingual household where mom spoke English primarily, dad spoke Spanish primarily, and they kind of learned both languages at the same time. So that falls more under the field of bilingualism, true bilinguals. However, depending on the age that second language or an additional language was learned, it could fall more under the field of second language acquisition. Say they started learning English first, and all their first words as babies were in English. And then at the age of 3, they started learning Spanish. By the time they're an adult, they're completely fluent in both. They're totally bilingual. You can't know any kind of accent. So they still fall under the field of bilingualism, but perhaps they also fall under the field of second language acquisition, their experience, because they started learning at maybe 3 or 4 years old, a little bit later. So it's just interesting to note that these fields can and do overlap sometimes. So here I've just pulled a couple of pictures to help describe a little better what naturalistic and instructed learners or learning can look like. I'm going to refer back to the text here when I look for it too. So naturalistic environments can be with families, watching TV, listening to music. They can just be multicultural neighborhoods, schools, friends in your class or in the cafeteria that you talk to. So for example, I'm picturing the neighborhood where I work. When we go to the library, the staff all speak English and Spanish. When we go to the corner store, the staff speak Spanish and English. There's a few Dominican and Puerto Rican restaurants around town, and the language there is actually primarily Spanish. So someone who grows up in that neighborhood who perhaps does not speak Spanish as a first language might acquire it in this naturalistic way in this setting because they just see it everywhere, hear it everywhere, they find its usefulness, etc. And then instructed learning is what it sounds like. It's much more formal. It can happen in a classroom. It can happen with a private tutor. It can happen on one of those Duolingo apps or online courses. So these are just different ways that learners can acquire language. Most people who acquire a second language actually acquire it through a mix of both. So let's think about what that means. Most people who acquire a second language acquire it through a mix of naturalistic and instructed learning. So if we think about the US, most students learn a second language in school, in the picture on the right, in a formal setting. They learn that way. We find out that most students don't become fluent or very proficient with just that experience. So I'll use myself as a case example here. I learned Spanish in middle and high school as well. I was very good at it. I got A's, but I could not speak, and I really couldn't understand people speaking to me in any kind of really proficient way. But I was great at reading and writing. So that happens a lot. Then I went abroad and I did a program where I taught in a bilingual school, and I was able to learn the language there in a more naturalistic way. So I went to the grocery store and I had to ask them to, cut my chicken for me, or I had to interact with the cashier. I started to make Spanish-speaking friends. I went to the movies in Spanish. So that was the more naturalistic way. And the mix of the two is really the only reason that I became fluent or proficient. So that's just a single case, but the text does confirm that most people who acquire a second language do so through a mix of both settings. So interlanguage is a term you'll hear a lot about in the study of second language acquisition. Interlanguage is defined as the mental grammar that a learner constructs and reconstructs. So this can be in their native language, in a second language, or in any additional languages as well. I think the video explains it a little bit better. You'll see that they show L1 and L2, like I talked about earlier, and they explain interlanguage as kind of this L3 that takes place inside the learner's brain. So I'll play that for you now, and I want you to just be focused on how is interlanguage connected to the study of second language acquisition.
Welcome to TESOLclass.com. Today, we are going to talk about the theory of interlanguage. Students have their native language, which is called an L1. When they learn a second language, it is called an L2. Interlanguage says when students are learning language, they are in a state of limbo. Their language is not like the L1, nor does it mirror the L2. The student's language is unique and considered an L3. Interlanguage has three characteristics. First, it's systematic. Students have a system of rules. They may not mirror the actual rules, but there are rules. Second, it's dynamic. Although systematic, the rules can change. And third, it's variable. Learning depends on the type of input and context in which the students receive language. However, interlanguage also stirs controversy with fossilization, which says that students increase in knowledge, then plateau, then increase in knowledge, then plateau. This continues over and over until the student reaches a ceiling and can progress no higher. The next logical question is, how does this relate to language instruction and learning? Visit TESOLclass.com and find out how.
So we'll talk more about how those topics do relate to second language teaching and instruction.
Welcome to
So let's think about, okay, there's tons of research in second language acquisition. It has a huge history. We used to have a course textbook that was super thick. It went through a lot of the history of the research, and we've decided to kind of take a different path. You'll see that there is some research sprinkled through here, and then they kind of give you summaries of what did the research really find overall? Where is research lacking? Because there were so many studies as people tried to discover, how do people learn second languages? Is there fossilization stage? Do you get to a certain point in your development and you can't develop further? I think we could probably, some of us think of someone that we know who's maybe lived in a country for a very long time, but they still have spoken that same way the whole time. They haven't progressed in terms of accent or in the vocabulary or in the rules that they use, like they talked about in the video. They might have a set of rules that they use that might not be correct. And even though they're getting input maybe daily, that doesn't match the way that they speak. For some reason, we don't hear them picking up on that grammar and rules. So let's think about the big picture. What is the relevance? What's the point? What can we do with all of this SLA research? There's a few anecdotes in the text that I'm going to read out to you just to talk about and have you picture how this research can really be used in the real world. So it doesn't seem so textbook. You can see that it has applications. So this first one. Parents who regard elective bilingualism as a social value wonder what the optimal age might be for their children to begin learning a foreign language. This question is related to the age of onset of acquisition, or how early or late in life one should start to learn an additional language after the mother tongue. So a parent might be wondering, when do I introduce language to my child? Family themselves might be bilingual, and they might be thinking about when should they start speaking a second language. Or there might be bilingual schools in their area, and they're considering when might they place a child in a bilingual school. I know in my case, I would love for my son to be able to speak Spanish someday. I read Spanish books to him because why not? And because based on the research, I think earlier can never hurt. All right, another way that research in second language acquisition can be useful. Policymakers and educators in different countries debate appropriate policies for minority children who speak other languages at home and need to be schooled in the societal language. They also wonder how long it should take them to learn the majority language. This speaks to many questions related to rate of acquisition, or how fast progress can be made in various areas of the L2, and how long is long enough to learn an L2. So these are questions about policy, which are really important and have huge impacts in the K-12 schools. For example, we think about newcomers from other countries who join schools in the US, maybe at grade 3. So let's say we have a third grade student who arrives from the Dominican Republic, and they haven't had any instruction in English before. They're in a test-taking grade. How soon do they have to start taking state tests? How soon does the school have to start counting their tests as part of their success rate? And for how long is that student allowed to receive that test in their native language and or use tools like bilingual dictionaries, etc.? So these are kinds of big decisions that really impact students and can impact schools who have a high influx of students that are coming from other countries who might be English language learners. And we really hope that the policies will be informed by research and not just made between politicians. All right, and effective instruction is another topic highly impacted by SLA research. This one's a little longer. If you like to read along with me, I'm on page 8 in the text, just so you know. Language teachers across institutions all over the world hotly debate whether students in their classrooms need to be directly taught grammar and vocabulary in order to get the basic building blocks of a language first, or whether it is better to somehow approximate in their classroom the richness of natural language meaning-making processes. Which of the two broad approaches or variations thereof would better prepare language students for what they will encounter once they are able to use the L2 for their own purposes beyond the classroom? This is the question of effective instruction, which plays out across many educational contexts in the form of tensions between formal and experiential approaches to learning. Whether in second, foreign, or heritage language teaching, the battles have been for and against traditional grammar teaching and alternative meaning-oriented proposals, including communicative language teaching, task-based curricula, content-based instruction, and focus on form instruction. So education, as you'll find, or you maybe have already found if you've been in the field for a while, is often cyclical. Schools, policymakers, et cetera, might say, okay, right now we're really into project-based learning, and that's what everybody's doing, hands-on experiences, getting into the community, bringing in community speakers. And then a couple of years later, we're focused on form again. Oh my gosh, kids don't know how their facts. We need to memorize facts and be fluency focused. I would say now we're kind of more in the swing of hands-on, critical thinking, project-based. But you'll see that these things come and go, and sometimes it depends on a principal, sometimes it depends on a superintendent, sometimes it depends on higher levels of legislature, et cetera. So being informed by research about the practices that are used in classrooms is really important. So I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about age and second language acquisition. This is a big topic. There's often a lot of assumptions about it. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see the entire comic. I hope my video is not on top of it, but I'd like you to take a minute to read this comic. This just shows kind of an assumption about language learning and age. So I'll give you a minute to read that, or you can pause the video. So this goes along with the little anecdote about parents trying to decide when's the best time to introduce a child to languages. And just to get you thinking about, okay, well, how many languages and what is the age and what is the best way? We're going to talk today about critical period hypothesis, which is a hypothesis that posits that there's a certain age where there's an ease of learning language, and then there's a huge drop off, which you can see in the chart below. Remember, this is a hypothesis. It's not something that's been totally proven, but there are some conclusions around it that we'll talk about, because enough research has taken place that we can come to some broad conclusions. So those conclusions I was talking about, we cannot delineate when this period ends. So it does seem like there is an age of easier language learning, but we can't put an age on it. Some have tried to put, puberty on it. Some have tried to say the age of 9 when the brain is less elastic, but there are always outliers. There are always other cases that show us that those hard lines are just not hard lines. So we cannot say that there's a specific time when this period ends. The research does seem to suggest that post-puberty native-like competence is less likely. So they've had studies where they had children or students that started learning after puberty, learning a second language, and then tested to see if native speakers could tell by listening to them if they were native or non-native. And most found that they could tell that they were non-native by parts of their accent or some of the words that they used or the way they constructed sentences, etc. The research also does seem to suggest that the child learner's accent is closer to native speakers. So if you start learning as a child, you're more likely to be able to develop an accent close to a native speaker. However, outliers exist, and I put that at the bottom because it's really important. I studied abroad with a boy who started learning the same time I did. He started learning Spanish in middle school, and my accent was very clearly American. And I went to go see my professor, and we would practice pronunciation, and she would say, I mean, you're pronouncing it right. You're pronouncing the sounds correctly. But there was just something about it that didn't sound native. I was still somehow being informed, by my English accent. So he somehow had a knack for languages. He had an ear. He was also a musician. He could listen to music and then play the same thing again without seeing it written. And he could do the same with language. And his accent could sound native to non-native speakers. So just to remember, there's outliers, and you'll see some stories about them in the text. One of the problems that's been talked about with critical period hypothesis is that it doesn't leave space for this more modern dynamic view of bilingualism, where these days people are talking about, well, okay, bilinguals might not be, the textbook perfect speaker, reader, writer in all of the languages that they speak, but they're bilingual. And it's the reason that they're not as textbook perfect in one language is because they have so many languages going on in their brain that they affect each other, and not in a negative way, that they're able to create language that maybe a monolingual speaker doesn't have the capacity to consider, say things in ways that a monolingual speaker might not consider saying them. So just knowing that there are some general conclusions, but there's also there's a little bit of problematics around CPH as well. Some other age factors that might be interesting to you. So older learners do tend to initially learn more quickly than child learners. So let's just say, okay, we put 5-year-olds in a classroom and we try and teach them French, and we put 16-year-olds in a classroom and we try and teach them French. The 16-year-olds will actually pick up quicker initially. The research is a little bit mixed about why, but they say, okay, well, those kids have, they're good students. They have learning techniques. They know how to study, they know how to focus and pay attention, just kind of general learning techniques that those students might have at that age. Also that they very much understand their native language, so they might be able to make connections. Oh, okay, I understand that in my native language, these are nouns and these are verbs and these are subjects, so I can understand that in my second language as well. Whereas the younger children don't have the capacity to make those connections. However, the child learners eventually do surpass, with enough time, those older learners. Age en route, so this is how they get to their final destination, their language learning destination. It seems to be that the research supports the route is the same for both age groups. They kind of follow the same trajectory. However, we see that children rely more on implicit learning, and older learners rely on explicit learning. Like we talked about just a second ago, the explicit learning, oh, okay, nouns, verbs, adjectives, whereas the children just hear and listen and see, and they kind of make connections in their brain without that explicit, this is a noun, this is a verb, etc. And we mentioned this briefly before, age and accent. So I'll read the quote and then let you read it again to yourself. There is clear evidence that accents are likely to develop when the L2 is first learned later in life. So I'd like you to just try and think about, do you know anyone who does have an accent when they speak in any language? An accent that's not matching the language they speak? And when did they start learning that language? And do you know anyone who speaks 2 or more languages who does not have an accent when they speak that language? You can't detect that they're not native. And at what age did that person start learning that language? It's something to think about. All right, so this is something you'll be doing when you're the book chapter discussion leader. You're going to post some kind of question or activity for people to do. You could post some kind of quiz or something, but your peers need to be able to respond on the discussion board with like a 1 to 2 page double-spaced response. It's nice to be able to give a choice to your peers so they're not locked into just a single item. So here I'm saying you have 2 options, just choose one prompt to answer on the discussion board. You always have to cite the text in your initial post. When you then go back in and read your peers' posts and you respond to peers, you do not have to have citations. So here are the two that you can choose from. Number 1, what has been your experience in terms of age and second language learning or teaching? what aspects of CPH and the age factor have you seen either confirmed or challenged? And remember, even though you're talking about your own experiences and ideas, you're connecting it back to the research in the text. Or 2, you're going to go to pages 7 to 8 in the text. And those are the scenarios that I read to you about the family trying to decide when to start language with their child, the policymakers making decisions around how fast students learn languages and the most effective forms of second language instruction, et cetera. So those are on pages bottom of 7 and 8. So for you to create another 1 to 2 mini scenarios like those ones to show another example of the possible significance of SLA research, and then you'll connect it to something from the SLA research. So you might say, so this relates to critical period hypothesis, and that's why it's important. And you'll talk a little bit about CPH and make sure you cite that from the text. All right, everybody, I hope you have some good takeaways from chapters 1 and 2 and have a little bit understanding of the body of research that we're going to be looking at second language acquisition in this course and where we'll be going. And I look forward to seeing your responses on the discussion board. So I will see you there.